So I'm with Canon Dr Howard Tomlinson, former headmaster of Hereford Cathedral School between 1987 and 2005, and also the school's expert historian on the history of the school. And I know you've got with you the very history that you wrote about the school. And thank you so much for taking the time to join with us today as we think about the history of Hereford Cathedral School over so many different centuries. And thinking about the years that you spent researching the school, can you think of anything that was perhaps a particularly surprising discovery or maybe an unexpected anecdote of which you came across in your research?
Well, thank you, Dr. Gray, for the invitation. And it's true, I spent 10 years on this book and enjoyed it enormously. As for the extraordinary anecdotes and activities, just two of many. There's a headmaster called Abraham Rudd, of course ordained, they were all ordained until 1919, who was a clerical entrepreneur in the late 18th century, and he did a lot to increase numbers, improve the schoolhouse, and the only trouble was that he overextended himself. It lasted only 4 years, from 1778 to 82, and he went bankrupt. The Dean chapter had to get rid of him, and he died in his early 40s, having been the youngest appointment in the 18th century, by his own hand. A very, very sad story from for an able man who just got it wrong for whatever reason. So he died since December 1794. Of the boys, I knew about the custom of barring out when boys excluded a master from the schoolroom. And there's good evidence that happened in the 1840s by the Reverend H. Hall. And the chapter order of the 7th of January 1845 says this: "The Dean chapter, having fully considered the present circumstances of the school, and without any expression of censure, deemed it better for all parties that as there was not any probability that Mr. Lang, who was the head at the time, and Mr. Hall would act together with the consent and harmony necessary for the prosperity of the school, that Mr. Hall, the undermaster, should be recommended to retire." And that's a nice way of putting the brutal methods of Mr. Hall and his unpopularity. So he was summarily dismissed in that way, having failed to convince the chapter that he should be paid for expenses. So that was one, and the other one is even more extraordinary. It's the story of a chorister, senior chorister, about 17, called Robert Carpenter. Robert Carpenter was, in his younger days, an exemplary chorister, but mid-teens he went wrong, as many boys do, of course. But this was a serious misdemeanor. And the allegation is that he was an arsonist who set fire several times to the College of Vicars Choral. Wow. We don't know why he did this, but we do know that he was charged, that he appeared before a grand jury in midsummer 1820, and for lack of evidence the case was dismissed. Yeah. So I don't think we've ever had in the long history of the school an arsonist in the pupil body. He was also caught on 12th of May that year having hired a horse and ran a long errand for a vicar choral road, about 20 miles, of being drunk in charge of a horse, basically. He stopped off at all the hostelries, went to the Swan at Hay, and got back absolutely legless. So he was a difficult boy, but he made good, because he, like his father, became a schoolmaster in Hereford, and his son, Thomas Carpenter, was followed as a chorister, and then a lay clerk. And we have a picture of Thomas Carpenter, not of his father. But that's an extraordinary find, an extraordinary story.
What an extraordinary story. You talked a few times about dean and chapter, and tell us a little bit more about that relationship between the school and the cathedral, because it's always been so integral throughout the history of the school, hasn't it?
It has, and from the very beginning. The story is complicated. The song school probably goes back to the days of Bishop Putter, and we're celebrating 1350 years of the diocese, allegedly. And the song school maintains its separate existence right the way through until the late 16th century, Tudor times. However, separate from that, there's a grammar school, Hereford, effectively cathedral grammar school, which was probably founded around 1200. That's why my book's called 800 Years. And that was in charge of the Chancellor, not the Dean and Chapter, the Chancellor, who was an integral, a key member of the Dean and Chapter. And he, as governor effectively, makes all the appointments and has superintendents in the general way, like governors today. And it's not until the new statutes of 1585 that the Dean and Chapter take over the school as governors, and they continue as the sole governing body until 1910, when the first two lay governors are appointed. So that's the rough sort of history in terms of the chapter and its members. In terms of the building, there's probably strong evidence. Well, there's no strong evidence, but there's a fair presumption that the school has always been close physically to the cathedral. And probably the early choristers would have lived with the clergy around the close. And the links would have gone on from there. So there are two things really in terms of the corporate body of the Dean Chapter and also the physicality of the school surrounding the cathedral.
And the school and cathedral kind of became separate organisations sometime in the 1970s, 1980s?
Yes, I think it's a long process, but it's a gradual process over the course of the 20th century. And of course, it's still, through the Dean being present, there's still a strong link. But the firm alliance, if you like, or the firm control of the Dean Chapter has gone now. But it did last centuries.
And thinking about what it must have been like at Hereford Cathedral School during the First World War, that must have been a really sobering and challenging time. Tell us a bit more about that, if you wouldn't mind.
Headmaster at the time, I've lost a lot of time for, was Reverend John Henson, 1913 to 19. It was incredibly difficult for various reasons. Firstly, the loss of pupils. First autumn of 1914, 14, I think, pupils who had signed up didn't, probably because of the war. The head boy left in October 1914 to take up arms, and it was a constant struggle for pupil numbers at the beginning. And the Welsh boys, because Henson came from Haverfordwest Grammar, helped save the situation, and the boarding numbers eventually increased. But there's a question of pupil numbers. There's also the problem of the governing body and Henson, a lot of friction, parental complaints about Henson, who was in fact a brilliant classics teacher, but at one point the Dean and Chapter asked for his resignation. About 1915, because of the parental complaints. He weathers the storm, brings inspectors in who give a glowing report of his teaching. So that was personally very difficult. Clearly, for the boys themselves, although it's a country area and perhaps the privations weren't as hard as they would have been elsewhere, nevertheless, rationing and difficulty in terms of the buildings and maintenance. £25 only was spent on maintenance of the buildings from 1915-17, £25.
Wow.
So they were crumbling. It was very Spartan heating and so on, almost non-existent. And for them as well, in terms of rations and the lack of opportunities. So games were basically cut down because of petrol costs. You couldn't travel with a team to Worcester. Some local games, debating and so on. So some societies continued, and of course the CCF flourished. OTC as it then was.
Yeah.
So that was, in a way, for that type of sporty boy, a type of salvation. Even so, it was very, very hard. Long route marches, bayonet training on my side. So it wasn't an easy time for either the head or the boys themselves.
No, it sounds very difficult. And thinking about a chorister from, say, the 1500s, travelling forward in time, let's imagine they travel back to Hereford Cathedral School now. What things do you think a chorister from the 16th century would find that's the same? And what do you think they might find that's very different?
It depends when in the 16th century.
Yeah.
If we're pre or post Reformation.
Sure.
If it's pre-Reformation, and judging by the 1250 roughly statues of the cathedral, their dress would have been very distinctive with tonsure. The statues talk about a broad and comely tonsure, about 1250. How that survived, I'm not sure. Clearly, the choristers would sing their daily offices in the cathedral, more elaborately in the earlier part of the century, but from the 1559, the Book of Common Prayer, the Psalms, as we know it, Tudor anthems, Bird and so on, still sung, polyphony, and certainly Geraint Bowden is very, very strong on this sort of anthem music. In terms of education, classics only effectively, and religious education. So that would be sort of familiar, but it would be a very different type of education, much more rote learning, and less engaging, I would guess, for the clever, maybe for the clever one, less engaging. The buildings, as I said, in the close, that would not, the close itself, not to be unfamiliar. The cathedral's more or less completed with booth, porch for the Reformation, so if we're talking about 1530 onwards, that would be almost exactly the same, apart from the west front, of course, which falls down in 1786. In terms of being astonished, I think the size of the school, its expansion, girls' co-education, the breadth of the curriculum, extraordinary range of extracurricular activities. Boys at that time were more or less left for themselves, apart from there were no sort of organised games. The amount of time even Robert Carpenter in 1820 had is quite extraordinary to us. And I think clearly within the close itself, the development of buildings, specialism, and lay staff, a huge change. I believe there's no ordained staff here.
No, that's right, yeah.
So in the 16th century, everyone who taught would have been ordained.
Interesting. Wow. There's pretty big differences.
It's a totally different world, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about all of the research that you did for this book, were there some really kind of standout myths or misconceptions that you came across around the history of the school? Because I suspect there's sometimes apocryphal stories or narratives that have almost become a truism just by them being passed on.
Well, there's one big myth, and that's the date of its foundation as a grammar school. When the first volume of the Hereford School magazine was published, there's a crest based on the cathedral crest and the chevrons and so on of the school badge, and there on the crest there is a reference to the foundation of the school in 1381, which is total nonsense. But that date stuck, and Headmaster Tatum wanted a new library, and what does he do? Launch an appeal in 1881 on the so-called 500th anniversary of the school, gets the money and builds the Gilbert Library. He calls it after Gilbert because Gilbert's so-called in 1381 appointed the first, in Tatum's eyes and lots of people, Headmaster Richard of Cornwall. That is total lunacy. A better date would have been the 26th of December 1384. 1384 would have been a better date than 1381. What happens is that Bishop Gilbert appoints Richard of Cornwall for 1 year because the Chancellor of the Cathedral, for various complicated reasons, would not appoint a headmaster to teach the boys. So Gilbert, as bishop, steps in, a Dominican friar, and appoints for 1 year only this man. The document clearly suggests that the school had been going on a long time before then. But the 1381 date stuck right the way through to 1931 and 1981.
So it's really, people talk about 1381 or 1384, but the school existed a long time before that, even though we can't categorically say it started on this date.
The difficulty of doing that is that, unlike Winchester, that has a foundation document, the secular cathedral schools don't. And there is no foundation document. You can gather from the cathedral statutes and other dean chapter records something about and sort of medieval enlightenment, which is happening in Hereford about 1200, that presuppose that there was a grammar school for the clergy who were then going on to a higher theological knowledge. But it's frustrating in that way. You can't pin it up.
Yeah, fascinating. So, clearly you've spent a good chunk of time researching and writing about the history of Hereford Cathedral School. Thinking maybe more broadly and more abstractly, why do you think the history of schools matters, and maybe perhaps particularly the history of Hereford Cathedral School? Why is this important? Why is this worth the investment of time, do you think?
Well, there's some good reasons for that, and I can quote a learned historian in a minute, but I think the history of any old institution, with school, business, livery company, college, provides interest, details of development, and particularly for the people who are successors to the people described, that's of great interest and importance in terms of family history. I think it's important for people to, and you've made this point often, to realise the need for continuity and the realisation that we're only stewards for a short time. And with a school which is centuries old, you have that perspective. And it's brilliantly illustrated, seems to me, in number 1, with that wonderful diagram in the Ochaparka suite. So the idea of continuum stewards of an institution only for a brief period seems to be important. I think you can, although history never repeats itself, learn from the past. You've got to, it seems to me, seize the moment at the right time. And although it may have bankrupted the school maybe at the wrong time, but I always regret that under my predecessor, the school, when they had the opportunity at a knockdown price, didn't purchase the Castle House Hotel.
Wow.
But I mean, that's just one illustration. But you need to clearly learn from Rudd overreaching himself. You've got to live within your means, but seize the moment at the right time. It's not easy, hey?
No.
I think HCS particularly sheds light, at least that's what I try to do in my history, on the cathedral, on the locality, city of Hereford, on national educational events when they intersect with the schools, such as the 1917 Act, which enables cathedral secondary schools and other schools to gain grants for higher courses, i.e. advanced courses. So our first grant was in 1919 for classics. And these grants were important in terms of advanced science, for example, and in a way rebalance the school finances. So it's that sort of thing, seizing the moment, I think is something which you need to be cognizant of, and how to adapt to survive.
Yeah.
I think I just got a Lord Blake. Lord Blake was a famous historian and one of his great books, The Biography of Disraeli. And he says this: the trouble with institutional histories, they are often merely linear categories of numbers, endowments, buildings, personalities, and curriculum changes, without broadening out into the social, economic, intellectual, and other contemporary factors which were shaping the development of the body concerned. For a school no more exists in a vacuum than a person does. Circumstances are always altering, and a school's history is largely the story of how it adapts or fails to adapt to those alterations. The historian has to steer somewhere between the parish band and the dance. I hope what I'm trying to do.
That's really fascinating. And that segues really nicely into the question around thinking about the highs and lows of the schools over the centuries. And you maybe touched on a couple of those anecdotes already, but what would you say reflects some of those real high points for the school? When would you describe its golden era, if we can use that term? And can you think of times when actually the school was in particular difficulties over the centuries?
I'm also suspicious of golden eras, because they're not always golden for those that have included.
No, sure.
But I've picked out 2 or 3 historians from my history, 2 or 3 headmasters who were, I think, significant. The great Dr Taylor, 1807 to 26, he was renowned among Old Herefordians even 90 years later. In 1913, the eve of the First World War, long after he died, there's a toast among Old Herefordians who gather for dinner to the great Dr Taylor.
Wow.
So his influence lived on. He was renowned among Old Herefordians. He establishes for the first time 100 pupils in the school in the middle of his period, 1807-26. An 8th chorister, Maria Hackett, who is the scourge of chorister education, goes around all the choir schools and writes a damning report of their education, praise Hereford Cathedral School under Taylor. He established 31 rules, for the first known rules to survive, and they're full of interest, severe, but he was obviously a leader who knew what education was about. He establishes the Madras system, which is essentially pupil teaching, and that's one of the reasons how on secondary resources he managed to expand numbers to 100. He got details of his prizes. We have a number of important assistant, if you like, under masters, if you like, casual teachers, including the artist David Cox. David Cox's house is not far away. It's one of the great watercolorists. So he appointed the right staff, and he was highly recognised within the diocese and the cathedral community. Severe, but he was a great headmaster. There are others.
Yeah. What about the low points? Were there times that were particularly bleak?
Yeah. I think the hardest times must have been, we talked about the First World War, during the war periods, in the modern period anyway. And the Second World War I haven't spoken about, but it was a people's war. The war was much more evident. American troops were housed in this very room and building. There were air raid warnings, although no bombs were dropped in Hereford. There were hundreds of pounds of bombs dropped, Robbers Factory, for example, fire watching, blackouts, privation. So it was much more real to boys, and maybe they had elder brothers fighting. It was a stressful time, but for the headmaster, it was again particularly hard. So I would say that is one of the difficult low periods. But the school came through it, and then the really low point in the early history, I would say, is the 1840s. School numbers went down. 3 headmasters. One of whom was a famous Victorian educationist called John Woolley, who was the founding headmaster of Russell, and a great Victorian educationist. He becomes first principal of Sydney University later, and then is drowned on a boat trip to Australia, but he was important, but he only had 2 years here. But by the end of the 40s, there's a handful of pupils, 1 day pupil, and a few boys. And the wag said, when he saw the 1 day pupil delivering his gun, processing across the coast, there goes the school.
Wow.
So, and from 1850, through partly dynamic Dean Dawes, whose tomb is in the cathedral, things began to improve. 1840s was a low point.
Wow, interesting. And again, thinking about kind of defining moments in the school's history, what would you say are some of those key pivotal events or occasions which have enabled HCS to be the school that we are today, do you think?
Well, I talked about this before. 1583 statutes were crucial, it seems to me, to put the school under dean and chapter control in terms of endowment, patronage, control, governance, giving the headmaster a house, for example, the schoolhouse, the oldest building actively in the school now. There are other developments under Francis Tatum I've mentioned, but for the first time the school comes physically out of the close in terms of buildings. So the mathematics block was 1875, first classroom block outside the close. Wyside was built. It was bought 12 acres of Diocesan land from 1882-3 as a permanent, they called it playground for the school. So coming out of the close and expanding in that way was important. Introduction of girls, 1970, first 2 girls, 500 boys or it was. And then co-education established throughout the school by 1980. And although some people were cross with me when I put the honours board in the library, I said it's from full co-education. So the first head girl is 1980 on that board. And we're ahead of many independent schools, certainly the big boarding schools. And that was pivotal. I would say the first ever Bursa, chapter class clerk, before Tony Hollingworth's appointment in 1972 was the administrator, essentially administrator of the school. There were no school accountants before Tony Hollingworth.
Wow.
And that's incredibly late.
Yeah.
Very important for the infrastructure. And one other, I would say, this relates to the present headmaster and governors, the consequences of the withdrawal of government grants. For the first time, total independence right at the end of my headmastership. The school had been subsidised through grants, advanced courses I mentioned, through direct grants and through assisted places, right the way through the 20th century from 1919 until the last AP pupil leaves, I think 2005, 2006, if my memory serves me right. And that had a huge consequence losing £1 million off the bottom line. We were a third plus since the place pupils running in.
Wow.
That was difficult. The consequence of Ripple's strong left. But also the establishment under my successors of a private school, and all that involves in terms of marketing, fleet of minibuses, going out to sell sort of a more professional organisation, I think. So we're still, I suppose, seeing the effects of that.
Yeah, and then with VAT and loss of business rates, you can see those other kind of financial shapings. And think about your 18-year tenure. What changes would you say did you see across the kind of the whole school? If you think about the school you inherited in 1987, the school you left in 2005, what would you say are the kind of the big kind of sweeping changes that you saw?
Well, changes in the educational marketplace I talk about in the book, and I hope that we reflect some of those during my tenure. And for example, just an example in terms of professionalism and appraisals, the first cohorts through GCSE, the first time from O-levels, changes in the reconfiguration of the campus. The growth of the junior school, moved to Old Deanery here from 29 Castle Street, the adoption, the reconfiguration of boarding houses, when we phased out boarding, and the use of boarding space like this building, the Old Deanery, and number one, number two. That was important. The acquisition, I think this was a game changer, of the old BT building, which is there. It gave us 20,000 square feet, which was of crucial importance for future developments. The remodelling of the library, I would say my things I was most proud of in terms of the building, which opened by Daley Briscoe, OH, who was near 100 at the time, 9th of December 98. And that we were able to do that because the studio theatre moved to the New Zealand building. So that was important. Pavilion at Whiteside extended, establishment of commuter networks across Castle Street, increase of support staff, very important. Once there was one school secretary, headmaster secretary, and that was it basically. So appointment of careers masters, for example, careers teacher. So in that way, I think we became more professional. People from outside, running careers, higher education in a way that teachers couldn't. As in the old days. So those are some of them, I think.
Yeah, and if we think ahead now rather than thinking back, and an impossible question to answer, of course, but let's fast forward. Imagine it's 2126, 100 years from now. What do you think the school will look like?
Another impossible question, but I've just thought about this looking back to 1926. Who would have thought, in the year of the General Strike, of course, how education would have developed in 100 years? And I don't think anybody would have guessed that, really. And historians aren't prophets. They prefer dealing with dead people. But I'll have a go. I think what I can say is that I hope that the school will continue with its ethos. So, where are those buzzwords? Good learning, respect, toleration, tolerance, Christian education, with cathedrals still at the centre. I wouldn't want, and I don't think probably this happened, but I wouldn't want to uproot to a greenfield site. And I hope that the choristers, however that's done, will still form a major and important part of the school. And I hope that, say, a foundation of 50 million could be achieved to enable everybody who has the intellect and interest to come to the school, irrespective of background, would be able to come to it. Mm-hmm. So the establishment of an endowed foundation, I hope, may well be achieved in 100 years.
And if anybody's watching this and wants to be a part of that legacy, get in touch. I'm always happy to discuss that. And that's really interesting. I think, as you say, it's always impossible to look ahead with much confidence. But we hope that those timeless values and ethos and what's at the heart of our community, the cathedral, choristership, all of those experiences will continue to go on for many, many generations to come. May I just say a huge thank you, Dr. Tomlinson, for taking the time today to talk about this. It's so fascinating to get your insights, and maybe someone will be watching this video in 100 years' time and be able to look back and see how much of these things have come to pass. But a huge thank you to you for your wisdom and expertise.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. I very much enjoyed talking to you.
Lovely, thank you.